Hello and welcome everybody today. Thank you all so much for joining us for this exploring research seminar on milk matters. My name is Julia, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm talking to you today from the Wellcome building in London. I'm wearing a green jumper, glasses, and I have longish brown hair. I work in the research development team here at Wellcome Collection, where I organise these events which provide a platform for current and topical research based around the collections. For those who aren't familiar with Wellcome Collection, it's a free museum and library that aims to challenge how we all think and feel about health by connecting science, medicine, life and art. Wellcome itself is a global charitable foundation that supports science to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone. If you haven't already noticed, we have an exhibition on at the moment about milk, and you can find more information about this on our website. This exhibition explores our relationship with milk and its place in politics, society and culture. A hefty topic, of course. It's on until the 10th of September. You can find lots of downloadable guides to the exhibition on the website if you're interested. This event today intends to tease out more nuances in the historical aspects of milk, particularly research that has been based around the collections here at Wellcome. So before I get started, I'm going to briefly run through how we're going to run the event. We are here in person, well, I am, at Wellcome Collection, and the event is being live streamed and it will be available to watch again on the Wellcome Collection YouTube channel. So hello to our online audiences. Your cameras and microphones will be turned off for the duration, but hopefully you can see and hear us. We have live speech to text provided by Jane today from 121 Captions. Hello to Jane. And a link to enable these captions will have been provided in the chat. The event is being interpreted in British Sign Language by Lynn Bateman and Paula Cox, who will take it in turns throughout the hour-long event. So the event will run, as I say, for an hour and will feature two 15-minute-ish presentations by our speakers, Deborah and Hillary, and there'll be an interactive audience Q&A for the remainder of the time. So it's an interactive event. We'd love to hear from you during the talk. You can chat and comment and ask questions, but be warned, you do have to be signed into YouTube in order to do that. And the chat moderator today is Megan. She's going to compile the questions and we're going to see how many we can get through in the time left. So, of course, this afternoon, we want everyone to have a positive experience. We want to create a safe space for people to share their ideas. So do interact sensibly and responsibly, respectfully. If you're struggling with the online platform at all or have a question, just comment in the chat box and we'll hopefully be able to help you. It might be helpful also to log back out and come back into YouTube if that helps. So onto the main event. I am delighted to introduce two wonderful speakers today who have both engaged with the collections with their research, and they are going to uncover how and why milk matters historically from two different perspectives. First up, we have Deborah Valenze, who is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of History at Barnard College, Columbia University, and the author of Milk, A Local and Global History, which was published by Yale University Press in 2012. This book was the first cultural history of milk, and I can highly recommend it. Her research has focused broadly on the relationship between British culture and economic life in the 18th and 19th centuries. She has another book coming out very soon in June, The Invention of Scarcity, Malthus and the Margins of History. So we look forward to hearing all about that. In her talk today, Deborah will trace how cow's milk has been used over time and how it morphed from a rural to an urban commodity. She'll explore early modern medical theories about its effectiveness for treating ailments ranging from melancholy to dyspepsia, and how these theories have contributed to myths about milk that persist today. And then Deborah will seamlessly hand on to Hillary to save on time. And so Hillary Nunn is a professor of English at the University of Akron, Ohio, and her current research focuses on the intersection between Renaissance literary culture and the era's domestic medical texts and cookery books. She's also just published a book called In the Kitchen, 1550 to 1800, Reading English Cooking at Home and Abroad. But she also wrote a book earlier on staging anatomies, dissection and tragedy in the early Stuart era in 2005. I have had the pleasure of working with Hillary, of course, in recent times with the Early Modern Recipes Online Collective, of which she is a co-founding member. We've been involved in several transcribing events with this group and are planning another one later in the year, so watch out for news on that. In her talk today, Hillary is going to be discussing the properties of different milks used in early modern domestic recipes, including almond, ass and human milk. She'll focus on the peculiar medicinal properties associated with red cow's milk, drawing on the manuscripts and books in Wellcome Collection. So the introduction's done. I'm now delighted to hand over to Deborah for her presentation. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks to the Wellcome Collection for inviting me. We've had fun so far putting together our ideas about this presentation. I'm sitting here in my study in Cambridge, Massachusetts, far away from the Wellcome Collection, unfortunately. And I'm wearing a white jacket and a blue top, wearing glasses at this moment, and I have short brown hair. Today, I'd like to begin by thinking first about how we can somehow dissociate ourselves from what we already know about milk. Could I have the first slide, please? Could we advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. I chose this image of supermarket milk just in order to give everyone the opportunity to connect with today's most frequent response, which is, oh, milk, you know, belongs in a plastic container. It's not what I choose to put into my coffee. Even since the writing of my book, I've had to contend with a lot of negativity about milk. Most people today think that it's more environmentally friendly to use alternative plant milks, when in fact it's not. But the truth is that all of the history of milk up until the very recent past has had to do with the wonder of milk. Could I have the next slide, please? It's the wonder of milk that really preoccupied the past. And as we'll see in our next image, visually and even as it's constituted, milk is amazing. And it certainly was amazing to the past. It was associated with survival, fecundity, and the often perilous journey through life, which entailed abundance and scarcity. And that duality will be with us throughout our discussion of milk in history. Could I have the next slide, please? There are two central paradoxes that I want to call attention to. And one has to do with just how commonplace we assume milk to be, how extraordinary it is. On the other hand, this contradiction is implanted in every historical period. Milk is commonplace, of course, because it's the first food of humans and of all mammals. It's associated with the mother's breast, and I love the way the exhibition concentrates our attention on breasts. Some of those sculptures are just fantastic. Because all humans begin life either feeding from the breast or drinking some substitute for mother's milk, we think of milk as ubiquitous. And at the same time, because it's life-giving, there's the anxiety that it remains scarce. And, you know, the endless interpretations around the world, not just through Christianity, and what we're looking at here is a Christian image. In every religion, milk appears in some form as an essential elixir. Could we have the next slide, please? One of those origin stories comes from the Hindu legend, the churning of the ocean of milk. And this image from Angkor Wat is just one of many in many religious memorials. The process of obtaining the nectar of immortality, Amrita or Amrit, occurred when this enormous ocean of milk was churned by legions of people who used a rope that was twisted around a stick and placed in the center of this container of ocean liquid. This is, interestingly enough, the only instance that I've found of milk as being absolutely abundant. In most of these origin stories, milk is actually quite scarce. For example, in the Western African Fulani myth, the world emerges from a single drop of milk. And some of these origin stories, again, communicate just how the assumption of the universality of milk is the beginning point for life and human life in particular. Could we have the next slide, please? One of my favorite images and one of my favorite stories is the Greco-Roman tradition of seeing milk as an elixir of immortality. And it was that belief, or that reality, I should say, in mythology that led to the creation of what we know as the Milky Way. This painting by Tintoretto is a representation of the story of how Jupiter placed his illegitimate son, Hercules, at the breast of his wife, Juno, in order to change little Hercules into a god. Juno was sleeping at the time, and the baby's sucking prompted her letdown reflex, and consequently, she sprayed breast milk throughout the heavens. And you know, the painting has a wonderful way of giving us this sense of not just godly action, but mortal action as well. You know, the letdown reflex, something that we'll see in the Wellcome Collection's exhibition, is in fact a universally shared female response to a newborn sucking on the breast. So again, another link that suggests universality associated with milk. Could we have the next slide, please? Well, we should turn to milk from the dairy, just so that we can quickly get to a slightly later date. Another duality that we need to think about is how milk occupies an association with nature. And at the opposite end of this duality is civilization. Over time, this duality played into representations of milk, but also the production of milk in the dairy. The question of how to get milk out of a cow was one of the technological conundrums of the ancient past. And it was solved in a very, let's say, scientific way. In the lower part of the image, you can see an ancient frieze in which a woman is at the tail end of the cow, while a calf is placed at the front end of the cow. And what's happening here is the same letdown reflex. The mother allows a human to steal her milk while the calf nuzzles her. This is the most effective way for us to steal the milk. What we see in the upper image is a beautiful Dutch painting of the dairy. The Dutch love milk, a fact, I think, which explains why the Dutch became the tallest people in the world. And here we see a milkmaid milking a cow in what looks like a very cozy, friendly space in the barn. But I think this representation would also be seen as uncomfortably close to nature by well-to-do people of the time. That is, milkmaids occupied this ambivalent space where they were thought of as pure, natural women, but at the same time, perhaps dangerously close to animal parts and animal life. And those of you who know gender history know that women are often seen as closer to nature than men are. And here is a perfect example of how, in every way, being bearers of mammalian genitalia in the form of breasts, and being the people who are generally thought to milk cows, women are definitely closer to nature. Could we have the next slide, please? So who rescued milk from nature? And I think it did have to be a rescue. Milk was not commonly drunk in great quantities in the distant past. It was, as Hillary will tell us, it was added to things in the cooking process. It was sipped perhaps in rural settings where it was clean and could be trusted. But in the cities that were becoming larger by the year, milk was often a dangerous commodity because of its contamination between the cow and the cup. But in any case, we have this wonderful image by Hogarth of a milkmaid, presumably in London, outside the window of an enraged musician. And she's an idealized figure. You can tell just by the way she's holding her apron as though she's in the middle of a dance. However, there were such women parading the streets of London with their special calls, and they would supply milk to spoken customers. And we know from the diary of Samuel Pepys that some people certainly enjoyed and considered such a drink as milk as a real treat. Could we have the next slide, please? Medical men arrive on the scene, taking up the ancient assumption of milk as a cooling substance and a purgative substance. And they advocate milk as an antidote to luxurious living in the 18th century. This is when we start to hear complaints of failing health, overheated bodies, bodies that are sated with drink and rich food. And this happens across Europe, not just in Britain. We hear from Enlightenment writers like Rousseau and Diderot that milk was a pure drink that could rescue people from all the kinds of moral failings that the city might introduce to their lifestyle. And here we see a famous English doctor, well known to the French, by the way, George Cheney, whose book, The English Malady, spoke of all of the common complaints of the 18th century, including melancholy, known as the English malady, and also various forms of indigestion, and in some cases, obesity, everything that people went to Bath to relieve themselves of. And Cheney's perhaps most famous patient was Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, who came to her, that came to him because she was experiencing an intermittent period of infertility. And Cheney recommended what he called a breeding diet: white meats, which generally meant dairy products, milk meats, similarly dairy products, butter, new cheese, light pudding, water, and milk. And in one case, he recommended a milk punch in which he mixed some imported orange. Now, medical men like Cheney understood milk to be an alternative to alcohol and all other forms of excessive or not so healthy foods and drinks. His milk diet was recommended for lowness, for any kind of ailment that his patients came to him with. And he did have positive results. He himself had used the milk diet to recover from his own physical and psychological discomforts. Could we have the next slide, please? As we move into the 19th century, milk became or remained one of the solutions to health ailments. And the centerpiece of ailments in the 19th century, as I learned from using the Wellcome Collection, happened to be dyspepsia. Dyspepsia was the 19th century term for indigestion. And I stationed myself in a wonderful alcove in the library for several weeks, reading all the textbooks I could lay my hands on digestive problems. And there were many. Here is a quote from Andrew Combe in his Physiology of Digestion. And you can see the third edition was out there in 1846. So the book was popular. What struck me about this book was just how moral messages were mixed with medical ones. And you can see from this quote that Dr. Combe is telling his patients to stop doing what they're doing, which is overindulging. He says, "Oh no, it is the fish which lies heavy on the stomach, or some other well-relished article. We have nothing to do with the mischief except as meek and resigned sufferers." He makes this point because it was very hard for him to change the mind of his patients. If you look at any of the cookbooks of the 19th century, as Hillary will tell us, the recipes show a plenitude of meat, lots of fats, accompanied by potatoes and all kinds of, additional dairy products like butter and cream. Combe, like Dr. Cheney, recommended that leaving everything out of the diet except milk could bring about a positive result. Could I have the next slide, please? One more example from one of these wonderful textbooks, and I can't recommend reading books in their entirety. The digital versions of these books will be available to you, but sitting in the Wellcome, flipping through this book was eye-opening to me. Sympathetic dyspepsia was an ailment that in which the stomach was simply a channel of communication. It was obeying an unseen master. That was the thinking, that the body and the mind were deranged by something else going on. And the mystery remains in most of the cases accounted for in this book. One of the most horrific cases was of a 19-year-old woman who came in experiencing what was called vicarious menstruation. And she did have dyspepsia, incidentally. That's why she ended up in the hands of Dr. Habershon. But she was vomiting blood, and this was seen as displaced menstrual blood. She was also refusing food. So she was restrained and fed forcefully with milk. And here we have Dr. Habershon's account of it. Milk was poured into her mouth, and she was made to swallow it. In this way, a considerable quantity of food was taken. The solution was milk, because milk was thought to be the perfect food. It had sugar, carbohydrates, it had protein and fats. And this was seen as a way of saving the patient. And in fact, it appears that she did leave the hospital in a state better than when she came in. Diseases of the abdomen has many more accounts of the use of milk as a solution to illness. Could we have the next slide, please? One case that I went into in my book that I really enjoyed exploring was the case of dyspepsia in Thomas Carlyle. He was a great complainer, and he found a multitude of ways of consuming milk in order to soothe his stomach. In fact, his servants even talked about it. They referred to what he was eating as master's pap. Pap was another word for baby food. Here he says to his brother in a letter, residence in the country with meal and milk ad libitum, fresh air and quiet, quiet. This is my constant daydream at present. He suffered till the day he died. Some people argued that his real problem was the fact that he ate so much oatmeal. But in any case, he viewed milk as his salvation, and it was good, clean country milk. When he was in his house in London in Cheyne Walk, he was one of the customers of these wonderful milkmaids with excellent supplies. Could we have the Last slide, please. I want to close by leaving you with this idea of the image of milk and just how changeable it is and how scrutinized it has been over time. Mark Tansey's innocent eye test is actually a painting, not a photograph. It gives us a sense of how even our friends, the cows, might be puzzled over images we're presented with. And I think the wonderful exhibition at the Wellcome Collection is a chance to explore all of those images. So thank you very much.
Hello. Okay. So I still see myself as muted on the screen. Am I okay? Okay. All right. All right. My name is Hillary Nunn. It's a pleasure to be here today. I have short brown hair and I'm wearing a gray top. I am very glad to have this chance to talk with you about milk in recipes, specifically milk from red cows. This talk is one that talks about the properties of milk in early modern domestic recipes, but it does range into some of the things that Deborah was talking about as well. So what I'm saying today is going to focus on the ways that the detailed oriented work of transcribing manuscript recipes can help us pinpoint trends in early modern medical care. And today I'll be looking at those trends as they involve milk. Transcribing recipes gets us up close and personal with medicine and food from previous eras. And this in turn means that we are often stumbling upon ingredients and techniques that seem strange to us. These peculiarities stick with us the more often we see them. The more transcribing we do, the more that these oddities can seem like signposts of what was normal to previous users. As a member of the Early Modern Recipes online collective, I do a fair amount of transcribing of recipes. As Julia said, we've been hosting transcribathons for quite some time, 10 years at this point, and we have another one with the Wellcome coming up soon. So you can join us and learn these things firsthand. So these manuscript recipe collections reveal to us a great amount about everyday life in the early modern era. They include culinary recipes, of course, but it's the medicinal ones that really catch my eye. And these medical recipes often use ingredients produced in the fields and farms that surrounded the country houses where many of these manuscripts lived. They were often passed from occupant to occupant within families, so they often didn't cover much territory. But at the same time, these recipes appear in city settings as well. Urban dwellers may have had easier access to some of the ingredients in these recipes, but other ingredients would have been harder to get their hands on. And that is something that puts milk in a particularly vivid place within these particular practices, especially when you get specific kinds of milk mentioned, like milk from a red cow, which is something that it appears in a surprising number of recipes. What made this milk special in the 17th century, and what happened to the distinction? Before delving into the world of red cow's milk, though, I think it's worth noting that cow's milk itself was just one variety of milk that was used in early modern medicines. Next slide, please. And Lady Ayscough recipe book at the Wellcome is particularly interesting in this vein. She has a recipe here for sheep's milk to be used that uses sheep's milk to treat blood in the urine. Next slide. Here we see her using dog's milk in order to induce labor, something that was really surprising to me. But she's not alone in this. On the next slide, we can see a recipe that uses horse's milk, or often mare's milk. This one is from Joanna St. John, and this is something that was used for whooping cough. And the next slide shows us what is probably the most popular medicinal milk, aside from cow's milk, and that is ass's milk. So this one, ass's milk is used for treating those who are suffering wasting diseases. And it lasted in its popularity well into the 18th century, as Lisa Smith has argued. And so she traces many examples of this in her blog post. And this was something that was seen as particularly effective in treating people who needed to gain weight quickly. Ken Albala shows that it's perceived as being closest to human milk. On the next slide, you can see that it is seen in one particular case, the Arscott family's manuscript, for example, as being key to cancer treatments at the time, that is nearly as important as the opium that's administered for pain relief. But what makes it so special? That is the question. So next slide, we can see in print versions of recipes some discussion of what the properties of ass's milk are. Here, Thomas Koch is talking about its particular density as what makes it effective. But he also says that you can use cow's milk as a substitute if you eliminate the cream. And so that gives us a window into this issue of availability. Who can get ass's milk, right? Where can you get ass's milk? Well, apparently many people couldn't. And as a result, we do have substitutions that come up both in print and in manuscripts. On the next slide, we can see that Anne Fanshawe, this isn't Anne Fanshawe, this is another Wellcome collection from the 18th century that provides a recipe for making substitute ass's milk, mock ass's milk. And this one involves snails, which are apparently easier to get than ass's milk. And so it's actually a quite common substitution. Sally Osborne gives another example of this on the Recipe Project blog from another Wellcome manuscript. But this, in conjunction with cow's milk, can get you a workable substitution for ass's milk. I do think it's interesting, too, that ass's milk is itself seen as a substitution for human milk. On the next slide, we can see that this is something that lingered into the 20th century. This table from a book that was concentrating on solving nutritional problems in India from the 20th century is talking about the different sorts of properties of different milks. And you can see that ass's milk is a close second even there in the properties of human milk, and that cow's milk is a distant third. And I think this is notable because of all the milks in early modern recipe books, cow's milk is the one that is most often mentioned. It is most easily obtained, but not all cow milks were created equal. And the different properties of them are sometimes harder to suss out. They are certainly not all easily available. The milk of red cows is by far the most often named in these recipe manuscripts, and its reputation lasted, at least in some circles, far beyond the early modern period. And we can see that on the next slide, where we see a calendar from the Wellcome Collection put out by Burroughs Wellcome that is talking about different methods of treatment in the past. And here in 1968, we are told that the milk of a red cow was thought superior to that of any other and had healing properties, that it was especially used as a remedy for various ills, especially chest ailments. And that is certainly something that we see in manuscript recipe books. The idea that it is something that is being associated mostly with chest ailments rather than dyspepsia is something that I find really interesting at this point too. On the next slide, a little bit about maybe why red cows were important. Richard Bradley, writing in the 1700s, argues that red cows were more vigorous and had more fluent juices than other cows because of their fiery hair color. So this is a kind of Galenic thinking where the redness is key to the milk's effectiveness on the body that is in the body that's consuming it. And the idea is that it balances out some of the sluggishness that comes with having too much phlegm in the body. So it's a pretty interesting sense of the internal impact of something from a particular kind of cow. On the next slide, we have a little bit more of Bradley's thinking about these red cows, where he argues that they're bigger, that they give more milk, and that is especially helpful for those with consumptive constitutions, and that they have better milk because their own bodies are more efficient, and that efficiency is passed to the consuming body. Those are things that I think are particularly interesting to think about when we think about the relationships between people and the sources of their food, something that we still think about today, but this is a direct connection that Bradley is working out here. And that connection is something that comes through in the medicines that are being prescribed and made with this red cow's milk. On the next slide, we can see that this comes through in print recipes as well. Here, the Countess of Kent's water for consumption is working with milk from a red cow, hoping to speed up sluggish bodies. And in fact, that's something that is consistent throughout this recipe. The very first line emphasizes speed, talking about how you should catch a running cock and pluck it alive. And so you're starting with the living world right away, and you're keeping that action and liveliness, that vitality, as the recipe moves on through. Of course, the cock does not fare so well. But that combined with the red cow's milk certainly gives that sense of action, efficiency, and fieriness. On the next slide, you can see that consumption is indeed something that pops up as being cured in relation to red cow's milk in recipe manuscripts as well. Here's Lady Ayscough again, who's working with a red cow and snail water preparation with a lot of sugar in order to get consumptive bodies going again. On the next slide, we have a recipe that involves red cow's milk in the making of stone water, this in print. So we do see a variety of different things being cured with concoctions made from red cow's milk. This one combines a gallon of new milk from a red cow with herbs and spices and a lot of white wine. The recipe should be made in May, which is something that is particularly important where dairy products are concerned, that milk in May was considered to be richer than milk that would have been available in winter because the grass is greener and coming back up again. So the pastures are in better shape. On the next slide, we can see a very similar recipe, this one from Anne Fanshaw's recipe book, at about the same time as the print version from the previous printed version for another stone water. This one doesn't demand that the recipe be made in May, but it does say that the phase of the moon is important, another kind of marker that you'll often see in manuscript recipes. But there are a very wide variety of recipes that call on red cow's milk. On the next slide, we see one in print that's used as part of a preparation for worms in children, perhaps a little bit more along the digestive side that Deborah was talking about. And on the following slide, Lady Ayscough again is calling on red cow's milk. I imagine her right next to the pasture as she's calling. She has a lot of red cow's milk. But this one is a cure for incontinence. And then on the following slide, this is apparently a brand new acquisition, or a newer acquisition at the Wellcome. Julia sent me this recipe that she discovered for the cure for a bloody flux in one of the recipe books that is now at the Wellcome that I haven't been able to see in person. So thank you, Julia. All right, so all of these recipes are ones that are working internally, but I do think it's interesting too that on the next slide we see a recipe that is for external application, and this one is for a face wash. So this might seem a little bit more prosaic than some of the other recipes that we've dealt with, but it is one that might seem a little bit more familiar because we do see milk used in beauty products today. I'm sure that most modern versions omit the puppies that Vickery also uses in this recipe, but it is interesting too to think about it in relation to the idea of color that we had brought up earlier when thinking about red cow's milk. This recipe does specify milk from a red cow in order to treat the face. It also is assuming that the puppies should be as red as possible too. So we have that sense of those fiery bodies being used again. And presumably this would have been a concoction used on red skin or skin that was reddened in order to calm it down. So we have an idea of opposites at play here too, something that I think is very familiar in the way that we think of early modern medicine working. And this is for an external application, something a little bit different than what we've seen in other places. But it still invokes those ideas of purity that Deborah was talking about, the sort of paleness of milk. But red cow's milk, apparently, as we move later into the dates of these recipes, red cow's milk is still being called on, but in different ways. So on the next slide, you can see that it is one ingredient in the mix. So the specificity seems to be fading by the 18th century, and you begin to have other kinds of milk brought up. This recipe actually combines red cow's milk with women's milk, or so it's called, in the way that it's phrased here. So the kinds of questions of availability come up, but also that idea that perhaps the specificity of the powers of certain milks might be fading a bit as we get into a time that is a little less bound toward with immediate agricultural production. The most vivid example of this comes on the next slides. The next one is just an example. I wanted you to see how this recipe looks on the page. It's a complicated one. And this is Lady Broderick's Cure for Epilepsy from a 17th century manuscript. Joanna St. John is keeping this. It calls not just for milk, but for human bones. Okay, this is not terribly atypical, but it is definitely a surprise to see it if you're not used to reading a lot of manuscript recipe books. And on the next slide, there's a selection that I think shows something about what changes as far as red cow's milk is concerned. Here, St. John's recipe phrases this in a way that's a little surprising in thinking about falling sickness. The ingredient that might be challenging to get is not the human bones. It's not the woman's skull or the man's skull, and there's specifics about who needs either one of those. But it's the fresh red cow's milk that's hard to get. She assumes you'll be able to get that skull pretty easily. So it's the red cow's milk is the one that gets the substitution. That's where she gives the advice on what to do if you cannot get it immediately. And this suggests a different kind of access to ingredients, where it's the fresh milk that is hard to get your hands on. Perhaps it's more of a city setting, but we don't know for sure. We know that St. John occupied both, rural and urban places historically. Also, the skull does not need to be fresh. The skull can be stored and transported more easily than the fresh milk from the red cow. But it's also interesting that the recipe doesn't seem as worried about the cow's source being red. What really matters is the freshness of the milk. So there's a little more wiggle room in this recipe where the milk is concerned than might have been expected in some other earlier manuscripts. All right, so on to the next slide. It's hard to move on from that one. So maybe there's also a change in perceptions about peculiar qualities of the red cow's milk. Here we have Thomas Koch talking about how he's not necessarily convinced that it matters what color your cow comes from, or what color cow your milk comes from. And he makes this assessment while also making a joke, one that also seems to want to point out qualities of women. As much as recipes have worked to establish the differences among milk, his joke seems to throw all of these out the window. What matters is that the female, human or cow, is young and well-fleshed, and his assessment of brown and black being best as sources for milk, whether those are humans or whether those are cows, carries with it something that definitely looks like a racial component. This can, of course, be humoral in its origin, but it's a notable shift from the preferences for red cows to ones that are brown and black. Perhaps this too is a sign of more cosmopolitan settings for his discussions, where there are different populations of both people and of animals. As troubling as this judgmental joke might seem, it is nonetheless pointing to the ways that humans and animals interact and can be seen as closer to one another than we often think of, and the perceived commonalities that arise from their mammalian nature is something that he is underscoring here. I don't want to imply that calls for red cow's milk suddenly disappear when people like Coke and Joanna St. John start to produce options any more than ass's milk disappears. It is also still something that is called on, as we can see in our assessment of different milks where nourishment is concerned in the 20th century. All of these differences still linger, and that is definitely true with red cows. Julia has pointed out that there are dairies that still advertise their milk as coming from red cows. There are a lot of pubs that want you to associate themselves with the purity of red cows. I also, just watching the Netflix documentary that Samin Nosrat has made, Salt, Heat, Acid, and Fat, I think was the third one. I got them in the wrong order. But she actually travels to Italy to see where the best Parmesan is made, and it is made exclusively from the milk of red cows. So this is something that is certainly still lingering with us today. And even though the idea of red cows and their milk as producing the best medicinal milk is the date of that association fading off is something that I think still needs more research. And it's something that I imagine can come through more transcription. The more transcription, the more of these recipes we have, the better off we'll be able to tell what these trends actually are. So thank you so much for the chance to talk about red cow's milk. It's something I've been tracking for a while, but this is the first time I've gotten to put it all together for people. So I really appreciate the invitation to do this.
Thank you so much, Hillary and Deborah. That was absolutely fascinating. I could just sit here listening to you all day about about cows and milk, and amazing. I mean, I hadn't noticed how much red cows are all over the place. As soon as you start looking for that particular thing, they're popping up all over, aren't they? And it is extraordinary. And this sort of obsession and with milk and the anxiety around milk and its production is I think it's clear from both your talks actually how, you know, this constant use of it for different all sorts of different ailments is really curious. We've actually had one question through, which I think is largely for you, Deborah, actually. So we haven't got that much time for questions, but I'll give this one to you now. How did the consumption of milk contribute to the nutritional well-being of different social groups in the 19th century?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's a big one too.
It's a big one, yeah.
Yes. Well, the 19th century is a period of change. And I think by the end of the century, we do see a broader consumption of milk. But before that time, the real discussion of milk and its nutritional value centered around children and babies. And most of that discussion had to do with sanitation. So in terms of nutrition, the discussion got going probably after 1900, when the problems of sanitation had partially been solved. I'm not sure if this fully satisfies the questioner. Perhaps we're leading up to the question about school milk. And school milk becomes one of the solutions to underprivileged populations who clearly aren't ingesting a full nutritional diet. And milk is one of the solutions offered. By then, the field of pediatrics had come forward, and that too, you know, that emergence rests a lot on this discussion of sanitary milk.
Yeah, and I think a follow-up to that question, possibly by the same questioner, how did the milk trade or dairy industry influence the economy and employment opportunities in the 19th century in England?
Yeah.
Another biggie.
These are good questions. And you know, one comment I wanted to add, this is not to reject the question at all, but the first comment I wanted to make was milk. The research on milk is phenomenal. I want to mention an historian named Peter Atkins, who's actually in the Department of Geography, who's written probably more than 100 articles on milk, some of which might answer this questioner's question. Employment possibilities did change. One example we like to look at historically is in the north of England, where the Women's Cooperative Guild brought forward this idea of organizing milk supplies to mothers and children. And they really pioneered some areas of, let's say, daily domestic delivery of milk. And we see that taken up by the milk industry as it reorganizes after the turn of the century. But it does take a while, and some of these areas have to do with 20th century history, not 19th.
Yeah. And just to follow, because unfortunately we are nearly out of time, so I just wanted to give a quick plug. Hillary mentioned the transcribing, the wonders of transcribing, specifically in early modern recipes, to really get a sort of understanding of how ingredients like milk, particularly red cows, is used. So we are actually planning another event later this year, so you can find out more about that. And there should be links in the chat to previous ones that we've done, so you can find out how to find out a little bit more about that. In terms of the next event, the Exploring Research Programme will return in the autumn for more wonderful research. But and it also, I probably ought to mention, there's another related image gallery that you can read about milk maize, which touches on quite a lot of the material that Deborah was mentioning, and that a link should be in the chat for that as well. But I'm afraid we've now run out of time, so I just want to thank Hillary and Deborah for coming along and giving us such wonderful presentations. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. If you had to disappear off this call, you can see this again. It is recorded and it'll be available on the YouTube YouTube channel, I should say, after the event. But in the meantime, thank you very much for all joining us here today. And if you would like to give us any feedback, please do so through the Eventbrite feedback form that will be coming its way into your email tomorrow, I think. So until the next time, goodbye. Thank you.